Welcome to the latest episode of Yahoo Finance's Opening Bid podcast. I'm Yahoo Finance Executive Editor Brian Sozzi. In just a moment, you're going to hear a real special conversation, one that I was looking forward to for a very long time. That's with Stephen Moore, a longtime economist and author. He's the Senior Visiting Fellow in Economics at the Heritage Foundation. Of course, the Heritage Foundation very much in focus with Project 2025, which they put into place, capturing a lot of headlines. But most importantly, Stephen is a longtime economic advisor to former President Donald Trump. And we wanted to talk to Stephen because there's a lot of attention and focus on what a second Trump presidency might mean for investors and the economy. Now, we've heard broad strokes about Trump 2.0 economic agenda. One of those, of course, is lower taxes. I think it's no secret that the former president wants to come in and not only keep his tax cuts, which are expiring in 2025, not only wants to keep those, potentially even lower them even more for wealthy individuals and corporations. So that is a key plank that he is running on, at least in terms from an economic standpoint. Number two, there's also no hiding his focus on China, potentially putting more tariffs on China, if not what some are calling on Wall Street a universal tariff across other countries. So lots of focus on what former President Trump might do on the tariff front. Of course, he enacted those tariffs against China, which were wildly unpopular when he was in the White House the first time. A lot of Wall Street economists that we have talked to saying a universal tariff against Europe and even more tariffs on China really might hurt U.S. economic growth. But that, of course, is to be determined. The finer points of that economic plan unclear at this moment. Also, to what the former president would want to do with current Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell. Now, we can go back and surf the former president's Twitter or X feed. He has not said many nice things about current Fed Chair Jerome Powell, has made it really known to the world that he has not been a fan of the job he has done. However, we've gotten some new details recently in a new interview with former President Trump that he is open to keeping Jerome Powell to finish out the length of his term, provided he does, I believe the quote was, a good job. Unclear what that actually means. I would imagine keep low interest rates for a long period of time. People go out there and spend. The economy does well, and Trump looks like a hero. Whatever it is, he is at least open now to apparently keeping Powell atop the Federal Reserve. Next, and this is interesting in light of the Elon Musk support now of Donald Trump. I think the former president wants to come in here and cut a lot of the EV initiatives or electric vehicle initiatives put in by the Biden administration. Not sure how that would impact Tesla per se. So funny to see Elon Musk warming up to the former president. Nonetheless, more final details on that EV production timeline or plan under Trump 2.0 White House, very much in focus. And then, of course, lastly here, immigration in this country. You know, former president has made it clear that he wants to deport illegal immigrants, millions of illegal immigrants, back to their home country. But what a lot of business leaders and investors that I talk to are worried about what happens to legal immigration in this country under a Trump White House for a second go-around. It's important to keep in mind that, you know, legal immigrants do support a lot of business growth in this country, notably within the tech sector. So unclear what happens there under a Trump second presidency. But again, we touch upon all these things in this new episode with Stephen Moore, of course, the economist, longtime author. I believe he's written 6 books, and longtime economic advisor to former President Donald Trump. Take a listen. Before we get into lots of stuff we want to talk to you about, how's the vibe on the ground there? For those not there, take us inside some of the things you're seeing and hearing.
Well, there's a real sense of optimism among Republicans right now after the events of the last couple of weeks. Trump is being treated like a hero. I mean, he really showed incredible courage under fire, and people are pumped up. There's a real sense that Trump has got the lead and that he can win this race. Lord knows what's going to happen on the Biden side, but Trump is really being treated like a conquering hero.
When you talk to voters in that RNC room, Stephen, what are some of their top economic concerns that they would like to see addressed?
Well, it's funny. We had an economic summit yesterday, and the 2 big issues were the issues that the Americans keep saying are the things they're most concerned about. One is the loss of control of our border, that we have to have a secure border. That's a top priority of the voters and also many of the economists. I think we need immigration. We just need to have a more sensible system where you can actually make sure that you get the immigrants you want and not having 8 million people come over the border. I think the second one, obviously, is what do we do about getting the economic growth rate up? How do we regenerate? How do we get to 3 to 4% growth? How do we get this debt down? How do you actually cut some of this outrageous government spending? We have a $7 trillion budget right now, and that can't continue or it's going to bankrupt the country.
A lot of the business leaders that I talk to, Stephen, CEOs, CFOs, you name it, whatever it is, even regular investors, they want to know more about the Trump economic agenda. We've heard broad strokes. How could the former president push through lower taxes given where deficits are? Walk us through this, and how fast do you think he can move if he does win the White House again on those lower taxes?
Well, we got to make sure we're not raising them. And I want to remind your viewers that if Trump doesn't win, Biden's talking about canceling the Trump tax cuts, which would be disastrous. Those tax cuts, and I'm a little biased because I helped write that plan, but they've been a huge benefit to the economy. We no longer have the highest business tax rates in the world. That's helped bring jobs and capital back to the United States. So we reduced, we doubled the standard deduction. That meant that now 90% of Americans don't have to itemize deductions. So we vastly simplified the tax code. All of these things have very positive effects on the economy. I'd like to see some further cuts, but if we could just keep the current tax plan in place. Remember, I want to state this again, that if Biden wins, automatically he says he's going to cancel all of those tax cuts. And that would be, I think, really negative. We'd go back to where we were, 5 or 6 years ago, with the United States having the highest business tax rate in the entire world.
Without those tax cuts, Stephen, what happens to the U.S. economy?
I think, it's not just that Biden is talking about canceling the Trump tax cuts. If you look at his tax plan, if you're an investor, you should run for the high grass, because he's talking about, for the first time ever in American history, taxing unrealized capital gains, which would be a disaster for investors. He's talking about doubling the capital gains tax rate from 24% to over 40%. That obviously is going to depress the stock market, obviously, because if you tax something, if you raise the tax on stocks, then the value of stocks goes down. So that should be a major concern for investors.
Also part of, some of the broad strokes we've heard recently, I think it was a Bloomberg interview just a couple of days ago. President Trump would like to keep Jay Powell for the length of his term till 2028. Why that change? Why do you think that change of tone from the former president? The former president has been very vocal against Jay Powell.
Yeah. Well, I've talked to the president about this. I think that the plan is that I think Jerome Powell's term is up in 25. I have to forget. About 18 months into the Trump presidency, I think the plan is to keep him there, and then when his term expires, then we would look for someone new, maybe a Judy Shelton or a Larry Kudlow or an Arthur Laffer, or somebody who's more in line with his economic philosophy. And I think that makes a lot of sense. I got time for one more question, then I got to run. I got to hop over to that convention for a breakfast meeting. But anything else?
Yeah. Well, let me just ask you. Just staying on the Fed. Project 2025 very much in focus, and part of that component was employment in the labor market. That plan would like to remove that from the Fed. Why would that be so important to remove that?
Are you talking about the Fed mandate on?
That's correct. Yes.
There's only one thing that the Fed should be concerned about, and that is controlling inflation. And they haven't done a very good job of that, obviously, in the last few years. Inflation's coming down, but prices are 20% higher than they were. The Fed can't have a climate change agenda. It can't have a jobs agenda. It can't have social policy agenda. It has to be the role of the central bank should to keep prices stable. I'm very much in favor of a Fed rule, a price rule, whether it's commodities or something else, where they shouldn't be making this up as they go along. American investors need to know what the policy is. That it creates incredible volatility when we're guessing every day what the Fed's next move is going to be. So I think the president's in favor of a price rule, and we are in favor of focusing on keeping the dollar as good as gold, and keeping, as the Republican platform says, the dollar as the world reserve currency.
Fascinating chat right there with Stephen Moore, economist, author, and longtime economic advisor to President Trump, pointing out that he did, in fact, help write those tax cuts when he was advising President Trump in 2016. My 3 takeaways from the chat with Stephen Moore: first and foremost, calling out Judy Shelton as a potential replacement for Jerome Powell. Of course, he's the current Fed chief. That was interesting. Also, Art Laffer. Now, both of those names have been tossed about in the past, but to see really, I think, an economic insider in the Trump camp like Stephen Moore calling out a Judy Shelton or an Art Laffer or even a Larry Kudlow, who's now of course, a host on Fox, but also has spent decades in the economic sphere as potential next Fed chair. Very fascinating stuff to hear that from Stephen. Number 2, Stephen seems very confident that despite higher deficits, Trump 2.0 would be able to push through even lower taxes. And in addition to cement the tax cuts that he pushed through in his first time in the White House. Interesting to hear that. So I guess deficits are not a concern there. And then lastly, too, somewhat confirming more that he would like to keep former President Trump would like to keep Jerome Powell in the position of Fed chair through his term. So if you're an investor and you're really plugged into what the Federal Reserve does or doesn't do, it would be at least important to know that there would be some continuity atop the Fed should former President Trump win a next term in the White House. Very important to keep that continuity in place, especially as the Fed potentially starts to embark on a lower interest rate policy or cutting cycle. But very fascinating chat there with Stephen Moore. And that's it for the latest episode of Yahoo Finance's Opening Bid podcast.